record. All right, so some scary numbers for you guys. In a regular semester, at times we'll do a whole 30-minute thing where I will show slide upon slide upon slide of all of these kind of crazy, scary numbers, mostly in an effort to use that fear, if you will, of those numbers to kind of make you take all of this very, very seriously. But I've kind of scaled back on all of that. So what I want to tell you guys is I want to illustrate something about the economic cost. So this is not just, and it's going to be related to kind of healthcare, but the economic cost of being sedentary, right? Not getting enough physical activity is going to cost you money in the long run, okay? And so many of you, if you are lucky enough, maybe either have health care that you pay for yourself, or maybe your parents or someone has health insurance and you are included on that health insurance. But the big picture is health insurance is really, really expensive. Going to the doctor is really expensive, one way or the other. Okay, and so what we can estimate is that total healthcare costs. So this is money spent one way or the other, either billed through insurance or people paying for it out of pocket. Okay, total healthcare cost associated with being sedentary, with not getting enough physical activity, is about $150 billion a year. Okay, and that's just in the US. So $150 billion. That's kind of an abstract number, right? Like it's so much money that it's hard for us to maybe conceptualize what that is or what we might be able to use all of that money for otherwise. So on an individual level, okay, if you are a person who is sedentary, you are going to, on average, spend about somewhere between 40 and 50% more every year on accessing healthcare than a person that meets the physical activity guidelines. That cost, that extra amount that people that are sedentary tend to spend, works out to somewhere around $1,500 a year. Okay? So that may be, that may be a number that is a little more kind of relatable to you guys. Can you think all I got to do is get off my ass and go out and exercise or walk around a little bit more, okay? And I can potentially save myself $1,500 this year, okay? Maybe it costs me $100 to buy a nice pair of, walking or running shoes. And then we got to get us some Lululemon leggings and a nice pair of shorts, right, and those things. But, in theory, just simply being active is going to save us $1,500. Think about what you could buy with that $1,500, okay? In the spring semester, I'm like, think about what you could do with that on spring break. Think about the cruise that you could go on, okay? Think about, I don't know, whatever else it might be. That's, that's several car payments, that's rent, that's, you name it, whatever it is that's important to you guys, okay? $1,500 a year. So then imagine that if you have, a family, and you've got a family of 3 or 4 or 5, then roughly if everybody in the family is sedentary, then that's not just $1,500 once, it's that over and over and over again. So you can imagine in some ways how this economic impact of being sedentary and having to access healthcare because I'm not being active, so I have high blood pressure and I have cardiovascular disease and I'm more susceptible to cancer and I have type 2 diabetes now. And because of that, I have to buy medication every month. Or, I have to go to the doctor to get this checked or that checked and my insurance won't cover this. Or the other part of those things, as you guys will learn when you have to get your own insurance, is as you get older, your insurance cost goes up because as you get older, you have to go to the doctor more because you're sick more often. And so when you're young and you're relatively healthy like you guys, you get better insurance rates because you pay to your insurance every month, but you don't ever actually go to the doctor. And so they're sort of banking money on you guys, and then the old people are the ones that are using it. I believe the number is that it's about 10% of the population accounts for about 90% of healthcare costs in a given year. So it's that sickest 10% of the population that cost everybody a bunch of things. So if we can get those people to be more active, then it saves all of us money in the long run. Okay? So does that make sense? I know you guys, a lot of you all had asked some questions about how are you learning best and those things, and everybody was talking about I need to see things and feel things and apply them and make it have some meaning to me in the real world. So I hope that maybe this is a way for you guys to kind of conceptualize that there are real, like, fiscal, in addition to kind of health related things that are going to play into just go out and go for a walk every day. Just go walk your dog for a half an hour every day. Or, maybe get a dog and then go walk your dog. Or if you don't like dogs, I don't know, get a different kind of a pet or something. Walk your cat, or I don't know. I'm a dog person, so. All right. So very, very briefly here at the end, the kind of last sum up slide is what do we know? And we're going to spend a lot of time getting into kind of the disease particulars of this, but why is being inactive so bad? Okay. We know that it's bad for us. And so there's a part of me that wants to tell you guys, it doesn't matter why it's so bad. We know we have mountains and mountains and years of data that says being sedentary is bad for our health. The how and the why doesn't matter. It's just be more active. But we have a little bit of an idea, okay? And our thoughts on this are kind of always evolving as we gather more and more data. That's one of the things about science. It's one of the most frustrating things as it relates to science, as we're looking at sort of the COVID pandemic, that frustrates me is it takes time for us as scientists to gather data and gather enough data to be able to make reasonable interpretations. And one of the things about being a scientist that's really important is that if we get new data, we have to be willing to change our mind or change our paradigm of what we thought was going on. We have to go where the data takes us. And so we can say one thing today and we really mean that, but then tomorrow we may change my mind. My wife yells at me all the time about all of that. Again, she was a history major and she somehow thinks that, like, people never change their interpretation of history and all of that. And I sort of frown at her. But some of the things that we think we know right now about why being inactive is so bad for us. One of the prevailing theories, and I have to be careful when I talk about all of this, and I want everybody to kind of be open-minded, is that we have evolved from, human beings have evolved over the last 30 or 50,000 years. Early humans were hunter-gatherers. Early humans were much more active than we were now. In order to hunt, to get food, or to move around and gather, right, like things to eat, we had to move around a bunch. And so what happened then, you couldn't just Postmates things. And so you needed to have, our genome needed to be in a way where we went through these alternating periods of feast and famine where you would kill a bison, and so you would have food for a week or something. But then maybe you would have several days where you had to go out and hunt and you couldn't kill anything. And so maybe you didn't get to eat. We had to be really good at storing food. We know that much. Our genes are designed very, very well when we consume excess calories, that we want to hold on to those calories and deposit them as fat in an effort to hang on to them for some future kind of date when maybe we're not going to get food on that particular day. And so those genes served early humans very well, but they don't serve us as well now. And I don't want to make, we don't want to make an overgeneralization that food insecurity and people being malnourished and things is a real and significant problem in society today. Depending upon the numbers, anywhere between maybe 20 to 25% of folks sometimes struggle with not getting enough to eat, and it is a big problem. But for those of us that are lucky enough to be able to eat enough, oftentimes we have an excess of food, and we can eat more than we actually need, and we're not very active. And so we're really good at storing. We don't have any of the physical activity to burn it anymore. And so this has then led to us kind of having a lot of these problems. Okay. And so this has really exploded with the advent of the internet and working at computers and those kinds of things, these changes in society that have gone on. But that's kind of what we think is going on. And so that our heart is designed to be kind of working all the time. Okay. Our lungs are designed to kind of be taxed and pushed all the time with this activity. And then when they're not, then bad things are going to begin to happen. Okay. All right. Anybody have questions about that? I'm always a little leery to kind of talk about evolution in class. I know that it can be sort of a hot button topic in that way, but we have lots of scientific evidence that we have evolved to some extent. We can have lots of philosophical discussions about sort of what the starting of all of that and the hows and the whys are, but to some extent evolution does actually happen. Okay. Any questions, guys? Anybody have anything that you want to ask or that you really want to know about sort of physical activity and health right now? Because we're gonna switch then and go off, and now we're gonna start talking about some physiology of the neuromuscular system. Okay. Nope. Okay. So I'm gonna pull up then our next set of slides. And launch that. So this is what we're going to spend the next couple of days going over. And if I'm not careful, I will get super long-winded about this. And we could spend an entire course. I have taught an entire PhD level course simply on neuromuscular physiology. It is one of my favorite things to talk about. So I will try to keep myself brief, and I will try to keep myself to sort of just the facts and the things that you guys really, really need for this particular class. Okay. So I want to start with a question. Okay. And with that question, what I want to ask is, let me see. Ty, are you there?
Yeah.
Awesome. Ty, what is the job of a muscle in your mind? What do you think a muscle is meant to do?
To move like the skeleton.
Okay, to move the skeleton. Perfect. Muscles generate movement. That's right. How do they do that?
From like not expanding, from getting smaller and pulling the tendon from one muscle to one bone to the other and pulling it closer to each other.
Okay, sure, absolutely. You're getting kind of into the biomechanical properties of all of that. That's perfect. That's exactly right. Okay. So like we will take my bicep, nobody laugh, okay? But if I take my bicep here and I contract it, right? My bicep, while we're doing this, it's a concentric contraction, so it's going to shorten and it's pulling on the tendon, which is attaching down here. Those of you that have had anatomy on the radius or the ulna, I don't know, one of those down here, and then that pulls everything up, right? So the muscle pulls on a tendon, which is attached to a bone, pulls the bone, and voila, I get movement. Great. But what's going on inside the muscle that allows it to pull on the tendon? Let me see if I can pick somebody else. Preston, are you there? Can you help Ty out? Like, what does the muscle have to do to be able to generate and make something move?
Is my microphone working correctly?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. So there's different kinds of fibers. There's the actin fibers and myosin fibers.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to remember back to phys.
Oh, that's okay.
One of them is like heads that like pull on the fibers of the other, and they kind of
correct.
overlap, which is what causes the shortening.
You're 100% correct. We have actin and myosin proteins that are going to be hooked together to make these filaments or these fibers like you're talking about. And the myosin has a head on it, and the head attaches to the actin, and then the head pulls or changes shape in one way, and it pulls the actin along. And then we get the shortening, and then that shortening gets transferred out, right, all the way to the tendon, and then that pulls the bone. Perfect. But you guys are still missing we're still missing the very initial event, okay? So yes, muscles create movement. That's absolutely right, okay? But muscles really only do one thing. Those myosin heads, which myosin makes up about 2/3 of the protein in a muscle, myosin does one thing that lets something move. Has anybody had physics? Nobody? Okay, well, okay, then we can't commiserate about how terrible physics 2 is then, and why electricity and magnetism are the most bass-ackwards things ever. Okay, so nobody's had physics. Let me try a different thing. Let me ask somebody this one. Judy, are you here?
I'm here.
Judy, have you ever lifted weights before?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Can you remember the last time that you lifted weights? Like, how much weight did you lift, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, it just depends, but when I was just doing curls, I'll do like a 20-pound bar, or sometimes
Okay.
I'll do like the 2 10-pound bars.
Okay, awesome. So Judy's lifting like a 20-pound bar for us. Why does that 20-pound bar weigh 20 pounds? It doesn't have to be Judy. Anybody can answer. Anybody know?
Gravity.
Gravity. Very good, Preston. Okay, very good. It weighs 20 pounds because of gravity. So if you want to move that bar that weighs 20 pounds, what do you have to generate to allow it to make it move? Anybody know?
Force?
Force. Very good, Judy. Perfect. Okay. You have to generate force, and you have to generate enough force to overcome, again, inertia, right? The acceleration of gravity on these things. So, long kind of roundabout way to get to this. Muscles have one job. Muscles are designed to do one thing. That one thing is to generate force, okay? The myosin proteins in the muscle generate force. When the head of the myosin grabs onto the actin and it pulls on that actin, what it is doing is it's generating a force, okay? Each little tiny microscopic myosin head generates a tiny, tiny little amount of force, okay? Myosin are called molecular motors. They're motors generating force. And so you have billions and billions of these myosin molecules in a muscle. And when you get a bunch of them attached and all pulling in concert, then it generates some amount of force. That force gets transferred to the tendon. That force is applied on the tendon to the bone. And then if that force being applied to the bone is larger than whatever it is you're trying to move, okay, then the effects of gravity on that weight or on the weight of your arm or something, then you're actually going to get movement in that direction, okay? So muscles generate force. We use that force to create movement, okay? So to tie that back as to why we think all of this is important, other than it's just kind of cool physiology, remember our definition of physical activity is it's a bodily movement. That first piece of things is a bodily movement. So in order to be able to move, to engage in our physical activity and hopefully improve our health outcomes, we have to have muscles generate force, okay? And it has to be a sufficient amount of force to overcome the weight of our body, plus gravity, okay? It's a sufficient amount of force to move our body upstairs or downstairs or to run at a certain speed, right? To run faster requires more force, okay? To squat more weight, more force, okay? So do you guys see the kind of initial connection that I'm trying to draw here in the big picture with all of this, okay? We need muscles to be able to engage in physical activity. So muscle is really, really, really important in that way, okay? Dr. Campbell and I, if anybody has had Dr. Campbell and I argue all the time about sort of what's the most important kind of piece of this physiology. I always laugh and I tell him that the muscles are the single most important tissues in your body. Nothing else, everything else that goes on in response to exercise only changes and exists to support muscles generating force. And he makes these other arguments that are clearly wrong, especially when he's not here to defend himself. But that's kind of where we're going, okay? So muscles need, as it relates to physical activity, muscles also need something else to allow them to generate force, okay? And the thing that they need, and we're going to get into a little bit of the individual kind of processes of kind of how and where this happens. To generate force, muscles also need energy, okay? They need ATP to be able to run something called the cross-bridge cycle that we will go through probably by the end of class today, okay? So in order to generate force, to be able to move, I need muscle and I need energy for that muscle, okay? That energy has to come from somewhere. And we're going to talk, not in the next couple of days, but next week we'll talk a little bit about kind of where are those places where the energy might come from, okay? All right, is everybody with me so far? Yes, no, maybe, thumbs up. Okay,
Yes.
awesome, we got it. Excellent, excellent. Okay, muscles have one job. Their job is to generate force. Now, as it relates to force generation, as it relates to movement, different muscles are going to look a little bit different, okay? You guys that have had anatomy and you had it at OU, you dissected a cadaver. You've seen that not every muscle is oriented in the same way. Some muscles are short and thick. Some are long and skinny, like your hamstrings or maybe the sartorius or something, okay? Some of them have their fibers arranged in different directions as it relates to the tendon, okay? The structure of muscles, the physical structure, the alignment of the muscle fibers, the alignment of the actin and myosin within those individual muscle fibers, okay? The structure and organization helps to impart the function of that muscle. Some muscles are designed to generate high levels of force. Some muscles are structurally designed to allow you to move very, very fast, okay? And so kind of for each particular job, we need a different tool. We need a different kind of way the muscles are going to be organized, okay? So form or structure helps us to impart function, even though the function of the muscles is the same. It's to generate force to allow movement. But we're going to orient things a little bit differently, okay? So what we're going to do now is I'm going to run us through a few slides. We're going to talk about some of the basic kind of structures and organization of a muscle, okay? What do they look like? What are the kind of big, important kind of cellular level structures that are going to be there? And then once we've gone through all of that, we're going to shift over and we'll talk about what's happening on the nervous system side of things, okay? Everybody with me? We good so far? Yes, I'm getting some nods of heads. Okay, perfect. All right, so let me thumbnail this down. There's my very super muscled up guy. We're going to assume it's a guy. So we've got some of our kind of learning objectives that are going to be on here. So to begin with, you have three primary types of muscles that are going to be in your body, okay? And We need all of them to help us engage in physical activity, to engage in exercise, and we need good health and good function in all of them. But for today, or the next couple of days, the one that we're going to focus on is going to be what we call skeletal muscle, okay? So these are the muscles that connect to tendons that are going to connect to your bones and are going to allow kind of whole body movements and things like that, okay? You also have your heart is a muscle. It's called cardiac muscle. And then you also have something called smooth muscle that exists encircling some blood vessels. It exists on the inside or kind of around your digestive system. And all of these kinds of muscles are able to contract and generate force. But again, their kind of arrangement of their fibers and things is going to impart some of their function. Okay? So the key thing to remember about skeletal muscle is it is what we call striated, and it has conscious control, okay? So what that means is when you look at skeletal muscle under a microscope, it has these very distinct stripes or kind of bands of light and dark. And those bands are the different proteins. Those are actin and myosin proteins. And they're organized in a way that they're all kind of running in the same direction. Cardiac muscle is also striated, but it is not consciously controlled. And then smooth muscle is not really striated. It's got muscle fibers that are going all around in a whole bunch of different directions. And so when it contracts, it does something a little bit different than what cardiac and skeletal muscle are going to do. We'll talk about cardiac and skeletal muscle when we get into the, or cardiac and smooth when we get into the cardiovascular system next week. Okay, but so for today, we're just talking about striated skeletal muscle. Okay, so in a big picture, okay, I tell people, and this may be kind of a weird thing, but does anybody know what a Russian nesting doll is? Anybody ever heard of a Russian nesting doll? I'm getting some thumbs up, okay. So Madison, you gave me a thumbs up. If you've seen a Russian nesting doll, could you try to describe that for the class? Like what does a Russian nesting doll look like?
It's this like little puzzle kind of looking thing where there are several different pieces. I think at least 8 is like the lowest number that I've seen.
Okay.
And it has a woman or whatever you want to put on there painted on it, and basically you can fit every single one of these pieces into the other one.
Perfect. Exactly right. So, and oftentimes the Russian nesting dolls, they're just like miniature versions. It's like big version of the thing, and then you open it up, and then there's a smaller version of the exact same thing, and you open that one up and a smaller version. They're all these kind of increasingly small versions of basically the same thing. And so that's a very great explanation, Madison. Thank you. Muscles are organized to me like a Russian nesting doll. Okay, so when you think about my bicep or maybe my flabby tricep that we have right here, what you see is a whole muscle. Okay, and so my whole muscle looks a certain way, but if you were to cut back the subcutaneous fat, cut through the epimysium and the connective tissue that's going to be there, down inside my muscle, what you would see is these bundles that are called fascicles. And my whole muscle is made up of these bundles of fascicles. All of the fascicles look kind of like smaller versions of a whole muscle, okay? If you were to then cut open, uh-oh, I may have clicked the wrong button. If you were to then cut open a fascicle, the fascicle is made up of these individual muscle fibers. And if you cut open one fiber, the fiber is made up of these mini fibers that are called myofibrils. You open up a myofibril and it has these little sarcomeres that are going to be in there. And then the sarcomeres are where the actin and myosin exist. And so all they are basically are these collections of bigger and bigger tubes or fibers that are made up of kind of the same thing. Okay. So in that way, to me, I like to think of muscles as Russian nesting dolls. So for our purposes in class, we're gonna focus very much on a couple of properties of the individual fibers, and then some things that are going on down on the sarcomere and the contractile protein level, okay? So with skeletal muscle, each individual muscle fiber is one cell, okay? It's one cell. Muscle fibers are some of, if not the largest cells in your body, okay? You can, if somebody would be willing to let us do it, which when I was a graduate student, we would actually take pieces of muscle out of people. We would take biopsies. You can, without the use of a microscope, you can tease out and see an individual muscle fiber from a person if they'll let you cut open their muscle and pull a piece out, okay? Most cells we cannot see with the naked eye. You at least need use some kind of microscopy to be able to see it. So muscle fibers are these giant cells, okay? That's going to impart a couple of weird things about fibers that we'll talk about in a second, okay? So fibers are muscle cells. Fibers are made up of these myofibrils, and then the myofibrils are made up of many of these like sarcomeres that are going to be these little structures that have actin and myosin in them that are going to be stacked end to end next to each other, okay? So if the fiber is the cell, really the important parts of the fiber where all of the actual force production and function takes place is inside the sarcomeres at the level of what we call contractile proteins, okay? So it's going to take place where the actin and myosin filaments are going to be located. And I'll show you guys a couple of pictures of those things. Again, we could spend a week talking just about all of the individual components of a sarcomere and how they fit together and exactly how we generate force and things. I just want you guys to have a kind of a very broad level of appreciation that what happens in order for me to move my arm like this, that there are billions and billions of myosin proteins in my muscle, each of which is able to tilt its head and move this tiny, like microscopic amount, and all of them moving in concert together are going to be able to generate this kind of large scale movement that we see on a whole muscle, okay? So people will say that the sarcomere really is the functional unit of a muscle or of a muscle fiber. The sarcomere is where the movement and the force generation actually takes place. And so sarcomeres are going to exist in kind of next to each other. One sarcomere shortens, it pulls on the next sarcomere, which pulls on the next sarcomere, which then pulls on the whole fiber, which pulls on the fascicle, which then makes the whole muscle pull, which pulls on the tendon. So it's kind of this small scale stuff up to a much larger scale, okay? So hopefully a lot of the stuff that kind of organizational thing is somewhat of a review to you guys, even if maybe you haven't seen it in a few semesters, okay? So there are a couple of structures on the muscle fiber level, these kind of smaller cellular level structures that I do want you guys to be aware of, because they're going to play an important role either in metabolism, okay, in how and where the muscle makes ATP so that it can continue to contract, okay? That's going to be called a mitochondria. So all of your muscle fibers are going to have some mitochondria in them. So a mitochondria, if you guys remember, is an organelle. We think that they used to be their own single-celled organisms. Mitochondria actually have their own set of DNA that is slightly different than the rest of the DNA in your body. It's kind of this fascinating symbiotic relationship. But the job of a mitochondria is to take some kind of food substrate, so sugar, fat, something like that, and oxygen, and break them down together and make ATP. Okay, so we need to know and understand how mitochondria are going to work a little bit to understand how we're going to be able to supply ATP and energy for our muscle fibers to keep generating force and keep us being physically active. Okay. Additionally, muscle fibers are unique among many cells in your body in that they don't just have one nuclei or one nucleus. They have many nuclei. Because the cells are so big, you can see them with their naked eye. Muscle fibers have many nuclei in them. And they have to have many nuclei because the nuclei is where all the DNA is. And we need that DNA to help us make more actin and myosin protein to go into that fiber to potentially keep it healthy, or in some instances when we do certain kinds of exercise to let that fiber grow and get bigger. Okay, so there is a reason that we don't see giant bacteria. There's a surface area to volume ratio for most cells whereby a single nucleus can only supply enough protein for a given amount of area inside that cell. And so in order for our muscle fibers to get bigger and bigger and bigger and have these very large cells, we have to have many, many nuclei in them to be able to supply what that fiber needs to be healthy. Okay. The surface, the cell membrane of a muscle fiber, it looks like almost all cell membranes. It's a lipid bilayer. It's called the sarcolemma. Lots of things inside muscle fibers are going to have the prefix sarco. It just means muscle. Okay. And so the muscle membrane is called the sarcolemma. And then inside of a muscle fiber, there are two additional structures that I want you guys to know. They're called transverse tubules, and the second one is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay. In our picture here, this gold tube that you see here, and then also back here, that is called a transverse tubule or a T-tubule. A T-tubule is in essence a tunnel, okay? It's a tunnel that leads from the cell membrane up here on the surface of our muscle fiber down into the inside. So it's going to allow us to go from the outside of the muscle fiber all the way down and be able to send signals down to those individual sarcomeres that are going to be contained inside the myofibrils inside the muscle fiber, okay? So the T-tubules are important because it helps us move a signal from the nervous system sort of across the muscle and get the signal we need down into the inside. Okay. Adjacent to the T-tubules on the inside of a muscle is going to be this kind of dark red web-like structure that you see here, and it's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so the sarcoplasmic reticulum are giant storage units, basically. Okay. And the thing that they store is the molecule calcium. And the T-tubules are going to be able to send a signal to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and they're going to tell the sarcoplasmic reticulum to shoot all the calcium that they have inside them out into kind of the interstitial or the inside of the cell space, into the cytoplasm of these muscle fibers. And that calcium then is going to be able to bind onto a molecule that we'll talk about next called troponin, and that's going to allow actin. It's going to allow actin and myosin to bind together then. Okay. So we use the T-tubules and we use the calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum to help us send signals. Okay, from the brain down through your spinal cord out to the muscles, and then to get that signal from outside of the muscle all the way down to where the actin and myosin proteins are going to be, so we can tell the muscle when to contract and when to relax. Okay, does that part make sense, guys? Are y'all with me? Are we okay on all of that? Have I put anybody to sleep yet? It's okay if I have. Y'all can tell me. I could talk about this like all day long. One of my favorite things, we'll start talking about the signaling on all of this. Sometimes when you fatigue your muscles and you get where you can't do any more reps when you're doing the bench press. Ooh, wait, we should ask Jordan, are we bench pressing again today? It's Wednesday. Is it second bench day?
Not for me. Today is just I take a break from lifting. I still run. I run most days, so.
Okay, well, good for you. Somebody referred in one of their questions, ask about the dude bros, which I thought was a great way to describe some of our bro science guys. But if you're lifting any kind of a weight and you get to a place where you can't do another rep, you've probably messed up. One of the reasons that you can't do more reps is that something has happened inside your T-tubules, and so you can't send signals from your nervous system to your sarcomeres anymore. And so that's part of why.
I have a question.
Yes, of course, Judy.
So I thought that, I think I learned this in anatomy, but I didn't think that the fibers themselves get bigger. I thought it was just like the fibers increase in number.
Ooh, no. So that's a great question. And there is some debate on all of that. But as far as we can tell, to the best of our knowledge, as long as you don't take anabolic steroids, we think what actually happens is the opposite of what you described, Judy. We think that most people are born with all of the muscle fibers they're ever going to have in their life. And generally, unless you take steroids, all that's going to happen is you can make the fibers you already have get a little bit bigger, but you can't actually add new fibers. Now, if you kill some of your fibers, like they get damaged, you can replace the ones that you have with new ones, right? But you can't ever actually go from having 100 fibers in my bicep to having 110 or something. And so we think that may actually be one of the genetic things that determines how big people's muscles can get, is if you're born with you have more muscle fibers than somebody else, you have a larger number contained in your bicep or something, then there's more fibers that have a chance to be able to individually get bigger than somebody that has fewer. So that's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so we know that in like cats and rats and things, they seem to be able to add more muscle fibers. We can, when we get, well, I don't know, we probably won't have time. We can talk about that on like an Bro Science Day or something. But they can do some weird things in lower animals that we don't think we can do. But it's hard for us.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But it's hard for us to have good data, because to know how many muscle fibers, we'll say that Whitney has in her bicep, I have to cut her bicep out. And my guess is that Whitney's not just going to volunteer to let me cut her bicep out and then have some poor graduate student individually tease out all of her muscle fibers and count them. And then we got to sew them back in, right, and have her train and do a bunch of curls for a while and then cut them out again and count them up again. So it's hard for us to have really good data. But to the best of our knowledge, that's kind of what we think is going on. Okay? Awesome.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to pause. We're going to go ahead and take a little break here, and then we'll start back up. So let's take 5 minutes and try to keep it. We'll try to keep it to like 8 minutes or something. Okay, so I'm going to pause. Start recording again. And I need to minimize you guys so I can actually see the slides. All right, so we're going to move on. We hit some key points on the muscle fibers. We're now going to move into talking a little bit more about kind of the myofibril structure, or the structure of the sarcomere. Now, probably in physiology class, and I know you will have to do it again when you take exercise physiology with Dr. Mike, is they will make you learn all of the different bands and zones that are going to be contained in a myofibril and in a sarcomere, where one sarcomere contacts the next sarcomere is called the Z disc. And then there's this M line, which is the midpoint of the sarcomere. There's an H zone and an A band, and all of these things. And they're mildly important, but they're not super duper important. The real take home from all of those is it's just a way of kind of showing where the actin and myosin are going to be located within the sarcomere. Okay, so what I want us to really spend more of our time talking about is kind of what does a sarcomere look like, and how are actin and myosin going to interact with each other so that we can actually get force production. Okay, so what you see in front of you guys, this is a cartoon of the structure of an individual sarcomere. So in the sarcomere is going to be composed primarily of actin and myosin filaments. And so what you guys can see here is these kind of brighter gold chains that look like a rope twisted around itself here and here. These are actin filaments. An individual actin protein is a sphere. It's a little ball, okay? And so to make an actin filament, you have many of these little spheres connected to each other, and then you have two chains of them that get wrapped around each other and form this kind of helix structure, this rope-like structure. Okay, so then interspersed with those myosin, or those actin filaments, sorry, are going to be these myosin filaments. And so a myosin filament is going to, under a microscope, myosin is a larger, kind of more dense and thicker protein than actin is going to be. And so an individual myosin molecule looks like this, okay? Looks like this thing up here in the top right. And so the myosin molecule has this head structure, kind of oblong head structure on it, and then it has a tail. In a lot of ways, it looks like a molecule, like a sperm or something in a lot of ways, but it has a head and it has a tail. And so the filaments are made by all of the tails of the individual myosin molecules getting sort of wound together, and they string themselves out into this big long filament. And then the head molecules are going to protrude off at like these 60-degree angles from each other in 3 dimensions. And so sarcomeres are designed this way very specifically because what it lets us do is it lets us pack the largest amount of actin and myosin into the smallest amount of space possible. Okay, that's why this is the particular organization that we end up with. Okay, the more actin and myosin we have, the more the myosin has the ability to bind onto the actin, and therefore the more force that muscle can produce. More force, more movement, or faster movement. Okay, so the structure of skeletal muscle is really designed to maximize how much actin and myosin we can pack into any given amount of space. Okay, so that's how this is going to work. All right, is in my sarcomere, when we get the proper signal, okay, from the calcium coming out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum, then the heads of these myosin molecules are going to bind onto actin, and once they bind, they're going to try to pull that rope like it's a tug of war in a particular direction. Okay. Okay. So what I want to look at really quickly then on all of this is there's 2 other sorry guys. There are 2 other proteins that exist on the actin filament. They're going to help to regulate when myosin can bind and when you're going to get a muscle contraction. So those proteins are called troponin and tropomyosin. So a show of hands or a show of thumbs up, who's ever had a cramp? Anybody ever had a cramp? Okay. So a lot of people have had cramps. Kylie, what do you remember from when you had a cramp?
Well, I remember one time I got a Charlie horse real bad in my calves.
Okay.
It basically just like was your muscle just flexing as hard as it can, and you can't really do anything about it.
Exactly, right? Did you want your muscle to be flexing at that particular point?
No.
Absolutely not. You did not tell the muscle to contract, and yet magically here it is contracting, okay? So most of you right now are probably kind of lounging pretty reasonably, okay? You don't have, if we did not have troponin and tropomyosin on your actin filaments, every muscle in your body would contract constantly all the time. You would just be just like one big cramp all the time, okay? So we call troponin and tropomyosin regulatory proteins. And their job, the natural state of being for actin is to have tropomyosin sitting and covering up like I use lots of little kid things. Because my daughter is very mobile and she's fascinated by like plugs on things, we've put all of those little safety deals into the light sockets, okay? So if you imagine that actin is the light socket and myosin is the end of the plug, then tropomyosin is those little safety things that you put in there to keep yourself from being able to plug something into the light socket, okay? So the normal state of being for actin is that tropomyosin sits in the myosin binding site and it keeps the myosin from being able to bind. Okay. I use this, and I don't know if it's a great analogy. Myosin's kind of creepy. Okay. This may be an apt thing for you guys. If you've ever had someone maybe persistently give you attention that maybe you weren't really that stoked about, right? That person that keeps like liking all your Instagram photos or sending you messages or whatever that you're not really loving, that's myosin, okay? It really, really, really likes actin. It really wants to kind of grab on to actin, okay? And tropomyosin keeps it from being able to do that, okay? Troponin is going to be connected to tropomyosin. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum releases calcium out into the inside of our muscle cell. That calcium binds onto troponin, and then troponin is going to change its shape. It's going to move. And as it moves, it pulls the tropomyosin out of the myosin binding site. So then, because myosin is creepy, it's like, ooh, the guard's, your guard is down. Here I come. I'm gonna give you a hug. I'm gonna grab you. Okay. It's probably not that's maybe not the world's best analogy. That's a little stalkerish. But that's what happens. Calcium binds to troponin. It changes shape. It moves the tropomyosin out of the way. Therefore, the myosin can bind to actin, and then you're going to get a muscle contraction. Because of this, you should only most of the time get muscle contractions when you want them to, right? When you tell the muscle to contract, it will contract. Otherwise, it exists in this relaxed state all the rest of the time, okay? So that's how we're going to help to regulate and have some level of conscious control in addition to our central nervous system on when muscles contract, okay? Everybody's still with me? We doing okay?
You said tropomyosin's the guard, right?
That's correct, Judy. It's the guard. Mm-hmm. It is the guard.
Calcium was the one that moved away troponin and made it change its shape?
Yes, that's right, Maddie. Mm-hmm.
What did you call, you said troponin and tropomyosin are what proteins? You called them?
Regulatory proteins, Lindsay. Okay. Regulatory.
Thank you.
They regulate the interaction of actin and myosin with each other. Good questions, all of them. Good questions. Okay. So the next thing that I want to talk about is, shoot, I'm trying to move one thing and it keeps moving something else. Okay. So when I have you guys up on the side of my screen so I can see a few of you guys, y'all don't see that, right? Y'all just see the slide? Yes, just the slide. Okay. Can y'all see my head? Like, can you see me or you just hear me talking?
We can see you.
You can see me.
The people.
You can change it like to where we can see other people.
Ah, okay.
Where we just see you, or to where we just see your voice or hear your voice.
See, I'm learning things. This is, again, I'm basically like my father. I'm an old man who hates technology now. So the next piece of things that I want to talk about is that not all muscle fibers are created equal. Okay, they're not all just these identical twins to each other. Okay, so muscle fibers have these very distinct, what we call types to them. Okay, and there are three primary quote unquote types of muscle fibers that are going to exist in every muscle in your body. Okay. Before we talk about those three, I want to give you just a tiny bit of history on the existence of muscle fibers, and I think that will help us or help you guys to understand why we name them in the way that we do. Okay, so originally, way back in the 1920s, when some of this was first discovered, what scientists noticed was when they cut muscle fibers out of animals, and they would cut the fibers out, they would look at them under the microscope, but then they would also take them and they would anchor them they would anchor them to like these little nails or these little posts, and then they would apply electricity to them. They would artificially make these muscle fibers contract. And then they would measure how much force do they generate, and they would also measure how quickly that muscle could turn itself on and generate force. And what they noticed was that there seemed to be these two general types of muscle fibers. Muscles that could turn on and generate force very, very quickly. And then other fibers that were distinctly slower, okay? And so originally, when people began to look at it and study the different types of muscle fibers, they called them fast fibers and slow fibers, or they called them fast twitch fibers and slow twitch fibers. A twitch is just they would isolate the muscle and they would turn it on one time. It would do one single contraction. That's called a twitch. Okay, so you had these fibers that could turn force on really quickly, and then some other ones that they were relatively slower. Even a slow twitch muscle fiber, it still contracts like really, really fast in comparison to like running or something like that. But there are these two kind of distinct types that we could see, okay? And so until the late 1960s and the early 1970s, until we made some advances in molecular biochemistry, people thought that there were two types of muscle fibers. There were these fast twitch fibers and there were these slow twitch fibers. And they characterized that what tended to happen is that animals that could run really, really fast tended to have more fast twitch fibers in their muscles than they did slow twitch fibers. Animals that had a very good endurance capacity, they could run or they could contract, maybe not as fast, but for a very, very long period of time without getting tired, tended to have more of these slow twitch fibers. And so we originally thought that fast twitch fibers are for sprinting, okay? Slow twitch fibers are for more kind of endurance type things. Well, with the advent of our ability to take muscle out of humans without, taking these very, very small pieces of muscle out, so we can do these things called muscle biopsies. When I was a PhD student in my lab, we would take biopsies from skeletal muscle. What we would do, and I apologize for what is about to happen right now. I'm going to stand up and kind of show you guys on my leg where we would take biopsies. You're gonna see some white thigh in the midst of all of this. I've not been able to get out and get in the sun, but so I have a pair of shorts on. I think I can do this. Okay. So what we would do is you take a muscle biopsy typically from out here in a person's vastus lateralis, and what you do is you make a little small incision that is about 1 centimeter long. Take a scalpel, you make a 1 centimeter long incision, and you stick this kind of big fat needle down in there. And I say it's a big fat needle, I'm talking a needle that is maybe, I don't know, like half as big around as a pencil or something. You stick that down in there and you sort of put some suction in and you suck out and cut off a little piece of muscle. Okay? The piece of muscle is about the size of an eraser on your pencil. It looks like the end of that. So we learned that we could take these, and then you put a little butterfly on the person, and you kind of sew them back up, and they go on about their business. It's not that painful at the time. It really hurts the next day because you give them local anesthetic and everything. You give people like Xylocaine or something, and you just feel pressure when you take it. But the next day, it hurts like shit. So when we were able to then take muscle out of humans, and we got better at doing biochemistry, what we learned was that there actually weren't just two kinds of muscle fibers. We learned that there are probably really 3 primary kinds, and then there are some what we call hybrid fibers that exist on a continuum in between some of those, okay? So there really are these 3 kinds. Those 3 kinds are determined by something on the myosin molecule. It's called the MHC, or the myosin heavy chain. Okay, and the myosin heavy chain is genetically determined. So your parents determined what the distribution of myosin heavy chain is going to be in every muscle in your body. Okay, so if you're a fast runner, thank your parents. If you're a good jumper, thank your parents. Okay. If you have a good endurance capacity, thank your parents. Okay. Yes, you can train and kind of move things around, but it's mostly genetically driven. And so rather than calling them fast and slow, people then made things more complicated and decided to call them type 1 MHC or myosin heavy chain, type 2, and then there are two types of type 2, one of which we call A, the other we call X. They used to call it type 2B, but we've now figured out that type 2B fibers exist in like rats and mice and cats and dogs, but we don't really have them in humans very much. And so as we look at this, type 1 muscle fibers are slow twitch fibers. These are the kinds of fibers that tend to have lots of mitochondria. They tend to be very good at endurance. And then the type 2 fibers are our fast twitch fibers, okay? But there is a distinct difference in the endurance capacity between type 2A and type 2X fibers. Type 2A fibers can have lots of mitochondria in them. So they can have a pretty reasonable endurance capacity. Type 2X fibers are like driving a tank or something, okay? They generate lots of force, they do it really, really quickly, but they get like, they got like 2 good contractions in them and then they're tired. So they get like 1 mile per gallon if you were like driving a car, okay? So we can characterize our muscle fiber types not only by how quickly they can contract, kind of turn on and generate force, but also on the metabolic profile and kind of how efficient they are at making and using energy. And so what we now know is that your genetically determined muscle fiber type can play some role in determining who are going to be better or good endurance athletes, who are likely to be the better sprinters or the faster runners, and who's going to kind of be in between. Most of us have a distribution of muscle fiber types that are about 60-40 one way or the other in every muscle in our body, okay? Most of us are somewhere kind of in and around 50-50. We can, if we wanted to know what that was going to be, we can, like we could have run when they ran some of the genetic testing on our daughter while she was still in utero, when they were looking for different diseases and things, we could have also had them do a genetic analysis to see what her myosin heavy chains were going to be. It's in your DNA, the code for those kinds of things. And so in some ways, whether we want to know what that is or not, is that like if you knew that you were going to have a kid who had the capacity or the genetics to maybe be a good endurance runner, would you want to push them to do that even if they really wanted to play basketball or something like that? We can kind of talk about if we want to know those things, but this is stuff that we can know. You cannot, no matter how much you train, you cannot change the percentage of your muscle fibers that are type 1 and type 2, okay? You cannot turn type 1 muscle fibers into type 2. You cannot turn type 2 into type 1, no matter how much you train. Train for a marathon, run, 150 miles per week, your type 2 fibers are never going to become type 1 fibers. No matter how many squats or box jumps, kind of explosive things that you do, you're never turning type 1s into type 2s, okay? You can alter the number of mitochondria in each of those by how you train. You can alter the way that your nervous system communicates them with how you train, but we can't change your fiber types in that way. There's no, you have whatever you have, okay? Now, you can have lots of fast twitch fibers and be a pretty darn good endurance athlete. You can have a lot of type 1 fibers and be a pretty good sprinter or a pretty good kind of short space, explosive power kind of based athlete. But in a lot of instances on the Olympic level distance runners have predominantly, especially at kind of anything over 5,000 meters, they tend to be very highly, over 80% of their muscle fibers are type 1. The vast majority of Olympic level sprinters are going to be predominantly maybe over 80% type 2 muscle fibers, okay? And so, some of those things at that level of being an athlete, you're born to be those kinds of things. You still have to work really hard to kind of separate yourself here and there, but a lot of that stuff is going to come out from there, okay? I'm looking, somebody put something in the chat. Okay, so, all right, so very good. All right, anybody have questions about that? Anybody have questions about fiber type or anything that maybe you learned about in physiology or something that you've kind of heard or you have questions about?
You said that we could change how much mitochondria is in them, right?
That's correct,
so
absolutely.
That would only change like the amount of energy you would have, right?
That's right, yes. So it's very easy. All of us have a fairly significant ability to improve our endurance capacity. Like we can all be better distance runners than we are right now simply by, or distance cyclists, simply by going in and doing this kind of more endurance type exercise, okay? Because all of our fiber types can increase their number of mitochondria, which means they have a greater capacity to make ATP without them getting tired, basically. Okay. We can train how the nervous system communicates with the muscle to turn them on a little bit faster. We'll talk about that probably on Friday when we get into kind of resistance training adaptations. We can train that a little bit, but we don't have near the capacity. Like you can train reaction time and stuff, but we can't train as well or to the same extent, like because we can't make more type 2 fibers if you don't have any. We can't train kind of how fast you can do some of that stuff.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Great questions. Great questions. Okay. So as I get back here, there's kind of some distinctions there in the fiber types. We can talk about those kinds of things. Okay, so really quickly here with our last kind of 10 minutes or so, I want to switch over from doing a little bit of the anatomy and function of stuff on the muscle side of things, and I want to talk about what's happening in the central nervous system and how the nervous system is we're going to start introducing this, and then tomorrow we'll do a lot more with this, okay? So if I ask someone, okay, like I can just see, Maddie, you're the first person that I can see on my screen. I don't know if anybody else can see you, but Maddie, could you just like pick your hand up and like wave it at us? Okay, so when I ask Maddie to wave, she thinks I need to wave, right? Somewhere in her past, she has learned that this is what a wave looks like. These are the muscles you have to contract to be able to wave and do all of that. And even though she doesn't think about it, really, she has to think about doing that particular contraction, okay? I need to make these muscles contract in this particular order for this amount of time at this level of force in order to pick my hand up and make it wave at us, okay? It's really fun for me because I'm nerdy to watch my daughter learn how to do new things, and she does them very slowly, and like she knows like when stuff is on her face and her peripheral vision, but she can't quite figure out where to put her hand to get it. Like you can see her thinking about, it is here, how do I make my arm do what I want to get there, okay? I say all of this to illustrate the idea that skeletal muscle is under what we call voluntary control, okay? You have these things that are called motor patterns where your brain knows there are areas in your brain that are going to send signals out to tell particular muscles to contract to generate whatever movement it is that you want to make, okay? At some point in your life, you did not know how to do that particular movement. Or maybe you weren't very good at doing that movement. You may feel very uncoordinated. That's because your brain has not figured out the proper sequencing or motor pattern of turn this muscle on at this time, this other muscle on at all of that. I mean, you think about how many muscles have to contract for me to pick my arm up and me to kind of be able to kind of wave at you guys, okay? there's hundreds of muscles that all have to contract at precisely the right time, in precisely the right order, at precisely the right amount of force. It's a very complicated thing to be able to move, okay? And so one of the ways that we know and we learn how to do these things is we have to have structures in our nervous system that allow us to send the proper signal and allow us to regulate how much signal goes to what muscle and when, okay? And we are not going to talk about what's going on in the motor cortex or in the prefrontal cortex, kind of in the premotor cortex. We're not going to talk about kind of pattern generating in the brain, okay? Dr. Berkowitz teaches a master's level course or a PhD level course in this, in biology, if anybody really cares. Really fascinating, really complicated stuff that goes on with all of those signals. We're going to just kind of generally assume that your brain knows what it wants to do, and we're going to focus on kind of what happens downstream of the brain. And so one of the really important structures in your central nervous system that allows for this communication between your brain and your muscles is something called the motor neuron, okay? A neuron is a nerve cell. It's a single nerve cell, okay? Motor neurons are going to be nerve cells, or typically we think of them as nerve cell bodies, that are going to be located in the spinal cord. And they're going to, each muscle in your body has several hundred to several thousand motor neurons that are going to be kind of the midpoint between the brain and getting a signal out to an individual muscle, okay? So if we were to dissect your spinal cord, there are, certain locations in your vertebrae, let's just say, we know that all of the motor neurons that are going to connect to the muscles that control my pinky, okay, maybe all of them are located at, say, C5 or something like that. We can dissect into your fifth cervical vertebrae, and we can look, right, and we can find those motor neurons. And then say the motor neurons that are going to connect the brain to my quadriceps muscles are going to be located down, I think they're at like L4 or something like that. They're much more down in your lumbar spine, okay? So motor neurons are kind of a midpoint. The brain sends a signal down the spinal cord to those motor neurons, and then those motor neurons are going to do something with that signal, receive some input from other things going on in your body, and then they're going to transfer that signal, send that signal on out through their axons out to individual muscle fibers, okay? So if something goes wrong at the level of the motor neuron, then your brain loses the ability to communicate properly with skeletal muscle, okay? So there are certain kinds of snake and spider venom that neurotoxins that when they bite you, it disrupts the ability of the motor neuron to send a signal out to your muscle fibers, okay? And so because of all of that, then you can't contract your muscles. You can't contract your diaphragm, and then you die. You suffocate, basically. And then the snake or the spider eats you, which is not really the most pleasant kind of thing, but, such is nature, okay? All right, so that's what's going to go on. So if we look at the individual structures of a motor neuron, there are a couple of things that I want you guys to know and be aware of, because they're going to help us receive signals from the brain, and then they're also going to help us transmit that signal from the motor neuron out of your spinal cord, out to the individual skeletal muscles, okay? So the nerve, the cell body itself, the neuron itself is called a cell body. That cell body is located in a very distinct place in the spinal cord. All of the cell bodies that connect to a particular muscle are going to be located in a very similar location in your spinal cord, like I said, okay? Like they're all at C4, or they're all at C6, or they're all at S1, someplace like that. That's good in some ways, and it's also bad in some other ways that we'll talk about tomorrow, okay? Around the cell body is going to be these little small feather-like projections that come off of these little fingers that come off of the cell body. These are called dendrites. The job of a dendrite is to gather information from surrounding neurons and bring that information in to the motor neuron cell body. Okay, so the dendrite is the information gathering portion of a motor neuron. It's going to gather information either coming from the brain or from other neurons located around it. Okay, the cell body is then going to be the place that makes a decision. Do we want that muscle to contract? Are we getting a large enough signal through the dendrites to make the cell body depolarize? If it does, then it will send a signal out down the axon. Okay, the axon is going to be a single projection that comes. Here's our cell body. The axon comes off of it. The axon leaves the spinal cord, typically out through the foraminal space in the spinal cord, and it's going to go out, and then what you think of as peripheral nerves, like I have my ulnar collateral nerve that's going to be down here under my elbow. What we think of as peripheral nerves are really just a collection of axons, okay? There's also some afferent nerve fibers that are bringing information back up from the periphery, but they're basically afferent nerve. They're nerve fibers. They're axons. Axons are very, very long, okay? You have to imagine that if the cell bodies for my muscles that control my pinky are at, let's just say C6 here, that axon has to come out of my spinal cord at C6, go all the way down my arm, and come all the way down here to the muscles that control my pinky being able to move, okay? So the ones that control your toes have to come out from, right, like S2 or S3 and go all the way down to your toes. So they can be very, very, very long. Axons are very long. Because of that, axons have specialized structures on them called myelin and something called nodes of Ranvier. Myelin is basically fat. That's what it is, okay? It's a sheath of fat that wraps around the axon. It increases its diameter. And then interspersed with these fatty sheaths are going to be what we call nodes of Ranvier. And it's at the nodes of Ranvier where we're going to have a bunch of sodium channels that are going to let us depolarize. And so all I really want you to know about myelin and nodes of Ranvier are that because the axon is so long, we need a way to make our signal transmission go very, very fast, right? If you touch something that is hot, you need to be able to pull it away very, very quickly, right? Or somebody is trying to punch you, you need to be able to move out of the way really, really quickly. So we have to send signals very fast. And so we have to cover a large distance very quickly. And so the myelin and the nodes of Ranvier help us to do that, okay? We're not going to get into all of the physiology of exactly the how and the why that happens, okay? All right, so for today, guys, I want us to stop here, okay?